Professor Allott. This is our fourth interview, and if we complete the chronology of your academic life, perhaps we can then talk about your books and your general views on international law in one consolidated section at the end. Firstly, just to return to a comment you made at the end of the third interview when you said you'd like to talk about your meetings with Robert McNamara and Henry Kissinger.
Yes, well, I thought we'd go out of chronological order completely just to mention four people who I happened to meet, and there was no substance at all in their meeting, but it was a sort of symbolic thing for me. And the first was Jean Monnet, the great instigator of the European integration process. And when I was in Brussels, it must have been 1973, the head of our mission, Sir Michael Palliser, head of the mission in Brussels, asked me to deliver an invitation to Monsieur Monnet, who was staying in a hotel in the centre of Brussels. And I think he probably did it on purpose in order that I should physically meet the man, the great man. And that's really all it consisted of. I remember to this day that it was, I think it's called the Hotel Metropole, perhaps in the middle of Brussels. And it was sort of in big public rooms there, very dark. And out of the darkness, he approached me and I approached him. And all that really happened was he said Monnet and I said Allott. And that was about the extent of our conversation. But as I say, he being really the cause of the whole European business, I thought it was quite exciting to meet him. The second was after the Law of the Sea conference. It must have been in the middle of the 1980s. I went to a conference in Hawaii on the Law of the Sea, organized by the university there. And an odd thing happened. Again, in one of the public rooms, I went in, not big public rooms, but just some room open to the public. I went in, and somebody was playing the piano, a Chopin mazurka. And I was pleased to discover that it was Elizabeth Mann, the youngest daughter of Thomas Mann, the great German writer. And Elizabeth Mann, Man Borghese as she was known then, was a sort of great environmentalist and Law of the Sea person. And since I've always had a bit of an obsession with Thomas Mann, this was to me an amazing event to hear her playing a Chopin mazurka in this incredibly unlikely place in Hawaii. Moved me greatly. And of course that's the closest I ever came to Thomas Mann himself, on whom I've spent far too great a part of my life. The third occasion was, I guess, in 1994, when I went to a conference in Stockholm, organized by the UNDP, sort of about poverty and the future organization of the world. And one of the other people taking part was Robert McNamara, who I think had probably just ceased being the head of the World Bank. And of course, very famously, he'd been Secretary of State for Defense in America during the Vietnam War, and before that, President of the Ford Motor Company. Well, we happened to be on the same little working group, he and I, and there was a dinner in the evening with us all sitting at circular tables, as you sometimes do. And he insisted that I sit beside him. And then we were terribly impolite because we didn't talk to anybody else at this table throughout the whole of the dinner. And I'm ashamed to say I can't remember what we talked about, except that I did ask him the sort of idiot question, have you decided how and why it all went wrong in Vietnam? And he said, well, it's interesting you should ask me that. I'm writing my memoirs, and I've asked myself the same question, and I don't know the answer. And then, of course, later he published his memoirs and I think late in life he began to apologize for all the awfulness of Vietnam. And then the final one, the fourth one, was when I went to a plenary meeting of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences in the Vatican. And another participant in that was Henry Kissinger. That must have been in 2007. And he was giving a speech and I was giving a speech to the plenary. And very oddly, we were staying in the sort of hotel they have in the Vatican for bishops and cardinals and so on, attending things like the election of the Pope. And Kissinger was staying there. I think he stayed there for 2 or 3 nights. And forgive me if I've said this before, you'll have to check. I remember one of his assistants saying that when he arrived, Kissinger said, "This is ridiculous, I can't stay here." Because, of course, it was rather Spartan, with no minibar and no television and no room service. But apparently he did stay. And I then saw rather a lot of him, because we had breakfast together one morning. Again, I'm afraid very rudely, not talking to anybody else, with just one other person at the table. Whom we rather ignored, and then he kept coming up to me in coffee breaks and so on. It was very odd. And again, I'm afraid I can't remember what on earth we talked about. You never do on occasions like that, although people, when they write their memoirs, always remember the conversation completely, word for word. Totally unbelievable. And I eventually did, when he got back to New York, I sent him my Health of Nations book, and either he or an assistant wrote a very nice letter back, saying that he remembered with pleasure our discussions in Rome. So those were 4 very odd events of no substantive significance, but those, to me, are very important people, and they sort of support one of my views, which is the enormous importance of individuals in the history of the world. It's a sort of Thomas Carlyle view of the history of the world, that oddly enough, there are probably great forces in history, uncontrollable and unpredictable, but there are also great people in history. What Carlyle calls world historical figures. And so that is quite interesting to meet such people.
Very. To return, Professor Allott, to the point that we reached in the first interview in the chronology of your career, there were 2 other sabbaticals while you were a lecturer. In 1995, you were a member of the Hauser Global Law School program at New York.
Well, perhaps I can distinguish. The one I went to in Dalhousie, the Bertha Wilson Distinguished Visiting Professor in Human Rights. I can't remember how long that was, but it was a matter of weeks that I gave a series of lectures. And since human rights is certainly not my thing, I've always been against it and never had anything to do with human rights, it was a little bit odd. And all I can remember of that is that I suggested to the students that we might create a completely new list of human rights, since the old list was both boring and wrong. And that became a bit controversial. I remember that I suggested, for example, that there should be a right to appreciate beauty. And the students got agitated about that, because, in the wonderful modern way of the young, they thought, oh my goodness, that would exclude unbeautiful things and people. So that was the end of that particular new human right. But Dalhousie was a very nice place, incredibly Scottish still, and very, very charming people. I mentioned the Gansoff van der Meer chair in Brussels. Again, that was not a chair in the ordinary sense. You gave a sort of grand lecture to a very large number of people. And that turned into a major article of mine on the seeing the European Union as a revolutionary phenomenon, a failed revolution, which just half a moment. No, I can't find it at the moment. I remember changing the title of it when I eventually republished it.
I can look that up at Professor.
Oh, here it is. It's in 1997. The Crisis of European Constitutionalism, Reflections on the Revolution in Europe. Later, when I republished it, I called it a half revolution, meaning that it had half failed. The Hauser Global Law program, which technically I think I'm still a member of, is a characteristically American idea at New York University School of Law, financed by the Hauser family, which was literally to establish a sort of global law faculty of people from different countries on a visiting basis. They were not there permanently. And then bring lots of graduate students from everywhere. And as I say, this was typically American and immensely ambitious idea. And it excited me because obviously I spent my life trying to create a globalized version of everything, including a university. So at first sight, it seemed to me a most marvelous idea that you would have a sort of globalized law school, really. And that has continued to the present day. I've been there several times on that. And then you do go for weeks or a semester or something, and they put you up again in an incredibly efficient American way. They have a sort of apartment house that you stay in. And that I've enjoyed very much because I enjoy teaching American students who are, of course, graduates or postgraduate students, often a good deal older. And then I spent in 1980, I think it was, a year, a true sabbatical at the University of Stanford in Northern California. And again, I think I may have mentioned this.
Yes.
Yeah, and I mentioned that was very useful intellectually, but a bit of a problem functionally because the person who'd invited me was no longer there. I'll just say one word about promotion in the faculty, which is a bit of a sensitive subject. Because I became a reader and a professor extremely late in life, for reasons that I don't know. Admittedly, for a very long time I didn't apply. And so one, not knowing the underlying reason, one has had to construct reasons for oneself. And the most optimistic reason is that my work has been rather obscure, and I suppose it wasn't completely obvious to people on committees what on earth I was doing. And in those days, it's all recently changed. In those days, becoming a professor was a huge event in one's life. Now they seem to become professors in their late 30s, or even younger. It's absolutely extraordinary. And at Oxford, I think now anybody who wants to call themselves a professor can do so. It's been devalued enormously. So that I must have thought that certainly until my book Eunomia was published and became known, it just wasn't worth applying. And there may be less optimistic explanations than that. I've always thought the fact that there is a certain feeling, not against Trinity College, but about the sort of privileged status of Trinity College. You know, that decent people in other colleges with wives and families probably need a professorship more than fellows at Trinity College who are bachelors. Knowing the way universities work, that was probably a consideration, to be perfectly honest. Although I've always got on terribly well with the other members of the faculty. So that's all I'll say on that subject. It never made much difference, quite honestly, in the outside world, because, of course, in America you're always referred to as professor. They have no idea, they can't imagine that one would not be a professor.
But, Professor Allott, looking back on your academic life, all in all, are you pleased that you made that momentous switch in 1973?
It's a very...
You're already a very senior civil servant.
Yes, it's a very difficult question.
I mean, you could have perhaps ended up as the next chairman of Coutts Bank.
Exactly. Well, I'm not quite as grand. Well, I wouldn't have anything to do with money. But you do, in old age, definitely begin to think whether when the junction in the road appeared, whether you took the right road. You certainly ask yourself. And I have to say that two things. One is that there's an enormous amount I missed about my previous life. And again, I may have mentioned this before, particularly that obviously everything you did then sort of was important in a way. Every single word that you uttered or wrote mattered. People were relying on it. And then you suddenly go to university and nobody cares tuppence what you say or do about anything. I find that terribly difficult. And secondly, the judgment I make of the choice that I made will sort of is still pending, depending on whether all that I've spent the last 30 whatever it is years on depends on the effect that has eventually. In other words, you quite rightly in your paper identified as a mission, a coherent mission. And so it really depends on whether that succeeds or not. And that may happen after I've departed this existence. But obviously we're going to come back to that. So I'm still undecided. I've not wasted a moment since I left the Foreign Office, it's true to say. I mean, I've, as it were, devoted night and day on the academic side of my life to this, what you rightly call a mission. So I can't complain. I chose to do all this. And as I mentioned, at least once before, I could have taken another road even within the academic life and become a rich practicing lawyer. So it was really a choice of three things.
There are still some aspects which we could talk about, which may have been important influences during the course of your career. And I'm thinking here of the three items in Who's Who: your high culture, fine arts and gardening.
Right.
And I wonder whether you could say whether they've been important to your career.
Yes, they've been absolutely. They sound rather pompous. Gardening sounds very normal. Everybody gardens. But to put high culture and the fine arts is obviously slightly provocative, because most people would put golf and classic cars or something. But it is true that for me they are infinitely important. High culture really means the best of civilization, and it's certainly part of my general mission to sort of rescue the best of civilization, not only European civilization, but any civilization, because the human race has climbed up this terribly difficult slope to improve itself. And there's reason to believe that it is now sliding down backwards on that slope towards low culture. And so high culture in the traditional sense, which is, as somebody said, the best that human beings have thought and done, is immensely important. So I do spend a vast amount of my spare time and free time on literature and the arts and philosophy and all these things. And I always say that, of course, this is what people, particularly in this university, always used to do. Universities are now so professionalized that there are very few generally educated people left. But our predecessors, it was expected that you would have a major interest in high culture and the fine arts. Everybody did. And so it's a slightly generational thing. One may be part of one of the last generations to attach such enormous importance. And the fine arts is again a thing sort of a possible road I could have followed, because from the early 20s I've been very keen on that and used to go to Italy a lot, as everybody did in those days, and did at one time think of specializing in the history of art, beside my other academic work, but I've never really had time to write about it. And in old age I keep thinking, when I can finish this wretched stuff that I work on, the missionary thing, that I would get back to writing books on the history of the fine arts, about which I then knew quite a lot in my 20s. So that's the sort of thing I hold in front of me. As far as gardening is concerned, that is, again, immensely important to me, both as a sort of physical recreation. When you spend most of your life sitting, reading and writing, to do something physical is immensely important. But I do have a sort of Francis Bacon view, or a Cicero view of gardening, that it is a sort of philosophical activity, in that you are creating something in association with nature. And it's immensely humbling, because nature sometimes doesn't cooperate. And I've been very keen on the sort of engineering side of gardening. I've had a number of gardens which I've always reconstructed completely by hand. And I remember, oddly enough, when I finished writing You Know Me At, was exactly at the moment that I sort of completed a garden in a house I then had, which had taken 20 years to create this garden. And I did feel that was incredibly symbolic, because a garden is a huge ordering thing. And to have sort of brought order into these two different fields at almost the same moment, I do remember thinking that was somehow of interest to me, but to no one else on earth, obviously. So gardening, I think, is incredibly important, and it's a humbling activity, but also a source of sort of pride as well.
And beauty.
What?
And beauty.
Yes, exactly. And you become more and more aware of the beauty of nature, and that's incredibly important. And very many of the people in high culture and the fine arts have been passionate about gardens, including Francis Bacon, as I say, one of my great heroes of this college. Yes, so that those things in who's who of under interests are absolutely genuine. They are the pastimes, as you might say, that I've genuinely had.
Professor Allott, I know that most of your retirement has been occupied with recasting your work into your novels, and we'll talk about that later, but is there anything else that has occupied your latter years? Perhaps your travelling, or your country house, and any other?
Well, I see, I've just drawn up for this college web page what is something close to a complete list of my scribblings, and I see I have done a surprising amount since 2004 in the way of writing. I didn't realise that. But in academic retirement, I suppose, is a bit typical of what everybody does, in that you get invited to talk at all sorts of things, which I now only go if I'm paid to do it. And certainly, so long as they pay the travel, so that you're in the marvellous position that you can do exactly what you want and only what you want, which is very good. And so that I think probably disappointingly, as so many academics say, my life has not changed as much as it should have done, because it's the most marvellous liberation, retiring, and you don't have the timetable of lectures and teaching and reading PhD dissertations and all the rest of it. So strictly speaking, one should throw that all overboard and go and do lots of interesting things. But it's not only me, but it's true of most academics, that I'm afraid they just go grinding on. Utterly ridiculous, they shouldn't do it. Whereas people in other lines of business do become completely liberated when they retire and do something completely different. You know, start a little business or travel around the world or something. But academics, I'm afraid, senior academics are terrible. We must have got into some awful sort of mad obsessional habit of writing and speaking. It's dreadful. So I keep telling myself, and I've told people a million times, that I will go off and paint, which I used to do years ago, and throw up all this stuff, get rid of it all, but I haven't yet managed it.
Which brings us to your very long publishing career, which spans 40 years from 1971 to 2011, a very complex scholastic journey, which, as you know, I've described as a mission. As you said in your Alex Roche lecture, 2006, your public intellectual life has been devoted to, and I quote, a revolutionary transformation of the idea of international society. Perhaps, Professor Allott, we can talk about this by generalizing the discussion into three parts: a general view, and then some reference to recurring themes, and then perhaps some long-term solutions and other relevant items. I wonder, speaking or giving a general overview of your publishing career, how the pursuance of your ideas has evolved and crystallized over 40 years.
Well, I think it's worth mentioning a thing that when we had a retirement conference for me in 2004, it was placed under the aegis of something that I had said, namely, that at the age of 16 I had written on a piece of paper, "This is not the way the world should have been." Unfortunately, I can't find that piece of paper now, but I did, when I was at school, write that. I wrote it on my birthday in 1953, and in the way you do at that sort of age of 16, I was struck by the fact that it was 500 years to the day since the sack of Constantinople on May the 29th, 1453. And at that time it was thought that the sack of Constantinople had led to the Renaissance in Western Europe because of the exile of scholars, very advanced scholars from Constantinople. Now, obviously, the view of the origins of the Renaissance is much more complicated. But I thought, oh my goodness, isn't that interesting? An interesting coincidence at that age. And I didn't know what it meant. But looking back, as we did at that conference, in a way, everything that I've done since has been derived from that. Because even when one's in the Foreign Office, one is seeking to make things better. And certainly when I started there, the British being then still seeming to be powerful in the world, seemed to have a special responsibility for the world. Well, in the negative sense, we created most of the chaos of the world ourselves throughout British history. And so the British seemed, and I think the ruling class in Britain recognised that it had an exceptional responsibility against, and because of the two world wars, of course, continental Europe was in such a mess that you couldn't assume that continental Europe would take any responsibility. The United States, for a long time, since at least the beginning of the 20th century, had been determined to destroy the British Empire. They could never fathom why on earth the British, tiny little island, should be involved all over the world. And it's one of the great sadnesses of history that the Americans took that view and that the British Empire was dissolved so quickly and so badly under American pressure. We were also ruined by the war. Of course, we couldn't really afford the empire. But one feels that it could have been done in a better way if the Americans had cooperated with us instead of trying to get rid of us and destroy us. Because, of course, we've been paying back loans from the Americans up until a few years ago. We've been reimbursing the Americans for the cost of the war. It seems incredible. Long after Germany had been reimbursing. And the IMF and the World Bank, in a way, were partly engineered by the Americans to destroy sterling, to replace sterling by the dollar. So there was a sense in which we saw ourselves, as Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, once said, we saw ourselves as Greece in relation to Rome, the Americans being Rome. In other words, we were the old civilization. The Americans were Rome, the new civilization. And they didn't like to consult us about things, but they knew that we had more experience, just like Greece and Rome. We were the old civilization, they were the new, and they were feeling their way in the world. So that was important to me, and that obviously declined the sense of us being important. I mean, factually it had disappeared, but the sort of image of us as being quite important continued long after the end of the British Empire. You know, because we were rather experienced in all these things. And I always certainly took that view and felt it was our job to do our best in all these things. And that meant that one was terribly critical of a lot that went on in the Cold War. As I've mentioned before, the Cold War obviously seemed like a sort of lunacy in a way. But it suited the Americans extremely well, and for a long time it suited the Russians to have the world organized in 2 camps or 3 camps. And it didn't really suit us at all. We didn't like being a sort of adjunct to the United States. We never really liked it or accepted it, but we were factually an adjunct to the United States. So at the ordinary level of civil servants and diplomats, we got on very well with the Americans, obviously, and worked with them endlessly on all UN things. We sort of jointly ran lots of things at one's level, not the highest political level, but at the everyday level of diplomacy and international diplomacy. we worked terribly closely with them. I used to remember in the UN that, because we used to always sit a couple of seats away from them, we were, constantly in touch. And occasionally, when something suddenly was put to a vote, we would sort of look to each other and put a thumb up or a thumb down to decide what to do. So that was a good side of it. At that level, we were enormously influential, and did a lot of good, I think. And then, so when I did leave the Foreign Office, as I say in the introduction to Preface to Eunomia, it seemed that one's task was to rethink the whole thing. Because not only had it led to 2 world wars and led to the nuclear standoff in which humanity could destroy itself at a moment's notice, the social and economic nature of the world was so disgraceful. That some people were living in luxury and 80% of the world or 90% of the world was living in abject misery and poverty, which was crazy. So taking a historical view, something had gone wrong in the development of the world. And obviously the 2 world wars had completely messed up the development of the world, which had it progressed beyond 1870, when Germany and the United States came on the scene in a normal way, who knows what the world would have been like.
It seems quite a remarkable coincidence that the publication of Eunomia coincided with the tumbling of the Berlin Wall.
It was a coincidence.
And the prospect of a new world order.
Yeah.
Were you immensely hopeful, Professor Allott, at that point?
Yes, it was extraordinary. And I remember whichever president it was at that time, I forget. Well, I certainly remember President Mr. Clinton saying it. I don't know whether he was president or not, because people started saying New World Order. And I had a mixed feeling about that. On the one hand, isn't it marvellous, they using the subtitle of my book. On the other hand, it quickly became clear that there wasn't a New World Order in that sense at all. It was pie in the sky. After the wall came down in Berlin, and then the Soviet Empire collapsed, there was a general assumption that all would now be for the best in the best of all possible worlds. But of course it took about 2 minutes to realize that this was not going to happen, and that the world was now going to go on, but in a much more complicated and more chaotic way. The Cold War had simplified the world into 3 camps, but now they had disappeared, those camps, and we were now faced with the same old chaos in a completely uncontrollable way, which of course we're now living through all these years later, and when now the present situation is obviously infinitely troubling. So I had taken the view. So I also, as a sort of third reaction to 1990, was, oh my goodness, I've wasted my time. Everybody now will think this and will think my book is very uninteresting because everybody's talking about the New World Order and nothing. I thought it was going to be a sort of revolutionary event. So I was worried that I'd been writing about the wrong world, as it were, and that this new benevolent world would need a different book. So it was a bit of a relief to discover that nothing had changed.
There was some criticism of your book, Eunomia. I'm thinking here of Marty Koskiniemi. He called it a Baroque aesthetic. Did this surprise you, Professor Allott?
Oh, no, not at all. No, it is a very, very peculiar book.
Did it spur you on, this sort of...
Yes, no, it didn't. It pleased me in a way because, as I think I say somewhere in the book, probably in the preface, that it's not a book to join in with other academic books. It's supposed to be totally different. It's supposed to be like books in the past, written by people. And I hesitate to suggest an equation, but just in terms of style, books by Bacon or Locke or Hobbes or Rousseau or Kant or people like this or Hegel, which are not academic books. They don't have footnotes. And they're supposed to be a sort of congealing or amalgam of a vast amount of what's gone before. And so they're not in any way about what have people been saying about international law, or what have people been writing about international relations. That was of no interest to me whatsoever. And what I'd done before the book was published was to spend 15 years reading. And reading in every conceivable field that might have any relation to the project. And I see in my website that's just been created, I've sort of summarized the project in 2 sentences. It's a bit depressing that 30-something years of work you can summarize in 2 sentences. But and I shall quote them. The main focus of the academic work has been the philosophical reconceiving of the international system as the society of all human societies and of all human beings, and of international law as the law of that society. This work is involved in investigation of society and constitutionalism at 3 levels, national, regional, and global, in the context of social and legal and general philosophy. And although those are just 2 simple little sentences, they do actually summarize the whole thing, which it starts from the idea that what's wrong with the world, it can't be repaired diplomatically or politically or by ingenious new systems, but it can only be repaired by changing all the ideas on which it's based. And the ideas on which it's based are more or less unconscious or certainly subconscious in relation to the actors in the system. The actors in the system, politicians and diplomats and economic operators, obviously have no idea where the ideas came from that they use the whole time. The state, the nation, democracy, capitalism. Everybody just has to accept them. And then they operate them. And they turn these ideas into reality. That's their job. But that means that they are conditioned and limited by the ideas that there happen to be. And so the view I'd taken, even when I was in the Foreign Office, was that it's the ideas that have to be changed, which condition and determine the behavior of governments and economic operators and so on. So that the revolution, as I say 100 times, would be in the mind, not in the streets. It would be getting people to see that there's an alternative way of seeing everything. And I encapsulated that on the first page of Eunomia as imagining an international society of all human societies and all human beings, not a society of states. The true international society is all human societies and all human beings, just as that's what a nation is. A nation isn't its government, it's a society of all the people and all the societies within it. So one way I've always expressed it is the extrapolation to the global level of our best ideas of society at the national or sub-global level. And that means looking into all the ideas that have made national society, which have been accumulated over the course of sort of 3,000 or 4,000 years. The human mind has worked enormously on the problem of living together in society and has made very great progress. Very, very clever things have been written and said about it. And then the great criticism that people have made, if you know me, that it's impractical. They always say, well, what do you mean? What would change? And so you have to explain the role of ideas, not only in the way people behave, but in changing the way people behave. And I always use the example of Rousseau, because it's a famous question whether Rousseau caused the French Revolution. And the correct answer is, well, there's been wonderful work on who was reading Rousseau in the 1780s. The correct answer is that he didn't cause it, but he made available ideas which turned out to be useful when the thing happened. In other words, reality then slotted in to what Rousseau and Hobbes and Locke and Kant and the others had been saying. These ideas were sitting there. Obviously, they were not known to politicians and diplomats. But when you had to explain the changing reality, they were there. So that's always what I've said my mission is, to create a coherent set of ideas which will be sitting there when the time comes. And of course, now, in old age, I believe the time seems to be coming through what is called globalization. In other words, globalization is actually the extrapolation of social phenomena to the global level. And government is now taking place regionally and globally to a huge extent. Culture is now hugely global. The economy is almost totally global. And so one is getting a little bit excited that everybody will be able to see that you do need a theory to fit the whole of this. It can't be simply a society of states any longer. There must be something as complex as we have to explain national society. And I've always said that it takes about a fraction of a second suddenly to switch your mind into this new way of looking at it, the social way of looking at it. You suddenly say, oh my goodness, yes. At the global level, it's just a social problem. And as I say, we've had 3,000 or 4,000 years of thinking about the social problem. And that, I think, now is beginning to happen. People do see that this must happen, and that it's ridiculous to go on thinking of international law as the law between states, or international society as the society of states. It's ridiculous. So when people say, how do you get from here to there, I don't worry about it. It will happen. And that's why I've started writing novels, of course, with the aim of trying to get to people who don't normally read extremely boring books published by OUP or CUP.
I wondered about that, Professor Allott, because they seem to me, your two novels published in 2005 and 2008, Your Invisible Power, like a biblical parable, a deep message told in an everyday format, telling the story in another way to another audience. And I wondered at what point in your career you decided on this very interesting strategy.
Well, I mean, it's partly out of despair, in the sense that very, very few people have understood all this reams of writing that I've done on saying more or less the same thing in 100 different contexts. And also the academic enterprise seems to be not useful. People, as you know, are reading books less and less. Even young academics now, I think, probably very rarely read a book from cover to cover. Very rarely. Because the new method, as you know, is to take bits, photocopy book bits or copy and paste bits. And I think it's terribly unusual for them to read from cover to cover. And as Marty Koskaniemi and the other people who've reviewed the book have said, but they put it slightly more politely, that Unoma is more or less unreadable. I've often wondered about the Japanese translation of it, because I think Hazlitt said this of Godwin, actually, William Godwin, that it'd be quite a good idea to put it into English first, because it's so difficult to read. And many people, from Ronald MacDonald's review onwards, have said that it reads a bit like something from the Bible, that it has very peculiar, a most marvellous analysis of it has just been done by a young scholar called MacDonald, I think, for his PhD, in which he does a rhetorical analysis of it. Does it very, very well. Because it is written in a very, very peculiar style. And it assumed, now completely laughably, that people would read it all. Because you mustn't miss a single sentence, as Koskaniemi kept saying. It's structured so that one sentence is followed by a second sentence changing a single word from the previous sentence, and then the third sentence changes another word. So you've got to read it absolutely carefully to understand it. That was a sort of obvious thing, but it was completely conscious because, as I say, it's supposed to be a thing, a great structure of ideas. It's not supposed to be an academic book. And people are beginning to understand it. A former student of mine, Ian Scobby, has written a marvellous essay on it for a book going to be published by Elgar Press later this year.
Is that published yet, Professor Allott? That's not...
No, it's going to be a handbook of the theory and history of international law, or something like that, by Elgar Press. And he's written a very good essay, which I don't agree with all of it, but he's made an enormous effort, I admire him very much, made an enormous effort to understand the whole thing and to communicate it. And it eventually came to be called social idealism, this theory of mine. And I'm now perfectly satisfied with that as a title, social idealism. And the idealism obviously fits it into a huge philosophical tradition, which says that reality is formed from ideas, on one hand, and going back to Plato, that the ideas can be the ideas of the good. In other words, that ideas not only construct reality, but can be a force for changing reality, which is called an ideal. So it's idealist in the two philosophical senses, that it looks at reality as a simpler structure of ideas, and also that reality contains the possibility of itself perfecting, which is the Platonic idea. So I want to apply that obviously now to and that's at the root of democracy and indeed of capitalism. Those are idea systems which contain the possibility of their own self-perfecting. That's what they are. Very, very clever. And so one wants to have that available now at the global level, that the global level is a structure of ideas which contains the possibility of its own self-perfecting. That's the message I want to get across. And so those novels are about a group of people who decide they want to do this. they want to get people to understand what the international system or social systems in general are like, but then to change it and improve it. And they realize that you have to do that subtly. You can't just shout at governments. They'll never change. They just have a vested interest in all existing power structures. So you have to somehow subvert all of them. And so this is the conspiracy, as you know, of rich and good people who are going to subvert government from within and plant these new ideas. And in the latest one that I've sort of got halfway through at the moment, the third one, I've got to prevent World War III, which seems to be looming. And I'm yet to discover quite how they do it, but in the course of it, they suddenly cause millions of people to see things in a new way. And the hero of it becomes very famous. He's always had sort of Christ-like tendencies, and he now suddenly sees himself as a redeemer.
This must be Greg.
It's I don't know whether I'll be able to finish it, but I'll try. As I say, I've got to just finish chapter 10 out of 20 of it, and we shall see. But that's the point of them, really. It's to get people thinking about this. They don't have to accept what I'm suggesting, obviously, but it's just to get people thinking. And that's so far been the only sort of success I've had, that people in the law of the sea, people in environmental law, people in obviously global forms of law have begun to think socially. It's obvious, think of environmental law, you can't possibly think of it. And I took this view about the law of the sea. I wrote several articles on the law of the sea because I became very excited by that it's a thing shared by the whole world. It's got to be sorted out by the whole world. It's got to be run by the whole world. And so I tried to suggest that the Law of the Sea Convention, concealed a very good philosophy within it. It was done by very tough bargaining among governments, but sort of concealed a hidden message of a slightly better view of the world. So that's, as I say, it's sort of seeping in that sense. And this global economic crisis at the moment obviously has caused lots of people to think and write about how on earth we live externally with things we couldn't possibly tolerate internally, degrees of chaos.
Would you recommend this technique to others who might have difficulty with contentious or complex issues?
Yes, it's. I wouldn't recommend it to academics, although academics, I think, may be going through a crisis. Not only the famous one about how to finance the universities and so on, but academics in the humanities, it is a very difficult question, given that there are now tens of thousands of journals, tens of thousands of books, which nobody can possibly read. I think young academics may be beginning to ask themselves, what am I doing? But fortunately, most of them still don't have a missionary purpose, missionary zeal. They see their job as teaching their assigned teaching and producing the books and articles you're expected to produce. But I do wonder whether the time will come when some of them say, what on earth am I doing? Nobody reads what I write. I have no effect on anything. That will not lead them into novel writing, I don't think. But it will be an interesting crisis.
In your Invisible Power too, there's some very beautiful prose. And I'm thinking of chapter 15, where Greg is on the Norfolk shore, Was it something of a release to be able to write in this way, unencumbered by facts?
Yes, enormously. You're so right. I was just thinking the other day when I was writing, and I popped in something completely preposterous. And I said to myself, oh my God, you could never put that in the American Journal of International Law. Because when you're writing creatively, you can say anything. It's marvellous. And so that is a huge joy of it. And in the second one, Invisible Part 2, I have this huge annex, really, which is designed really to be a sort of general education to suggest that, behind these very simple goings-on, there must be the whole of civilization and accumulated human thought. It's just sort of to remind people that behind these sort of very ordinary goings-on of life, there's a vast wealth of human experience and human thought, which nobody's aware of. As I say, in the past, people, particularly in these universities, would have sort of known about it. What Greece and Rome and China and India contributed and so on. People wouldn't have known very much, but would have known. But now you can't rely on that. So that was the sort of symbolic purpose of it, to remind people how incredibly interesting the background to everyday things is. Because people accept everyday things as if they were just sort of sitting there. They've come out of nowhere. And they've all been created by human beings thinking. It's amazing. So I've said a million times, why should we stop thinking? All our predecessors have thought, and things have sort of changed, for better or for worse, they've changed. Why do we stop? And that's why I've been so obsessed by the awfulness of 20th century philosophy, which I've written fiercely, because that's at the very worst moment, when people were behaving in the most unspeakable manner. Philosophers said, well, philosophy is a matter of words, it's more or less you think what you like, anybody can think anything they like, there's no such thing as truth, and good is just a polite name for pleasure and so on. And that was a terrible thing to be saying, and it wasn't correct, because philosophy is not just simply words. It's constructing a view of the world and a view of the mind which is useful. And if you stop doing it, everything will decline. So that's my absolutely obsessional interest. And that, I tell you, is a very uphill task, because even philosophy now is beginning to change. And people are getting back much more to substantive philosophy, which means eventually getting back to Plato and Aristotle, from which all Western philosophy comes. So there are signs that that is beginning to change.
Professor Allott, that brings us to some of the themes that reoccur in your works, and I wonder whether you would like us to stop at this point and deal with these in a further interview, or will you prefer to carry on?
We could carry on a bit longer, perhaps.
You've already mentioned that it was fundamentally to change society and international law that your publications were directed over 40 years of publishing, and certain topics are recurring themes in your books and your papers. And I wonder if I could ask you to comment specifically on some of these, and to learn if you've observed any improvements towards your preferred position over the time during your career. So if we look at them perhaps under some broad headings, starting perhaps with at the global level, where you diagnose that the world and the general political and social situations were in a dreadful mess during the 20th century. I'm thinking here of the wars, the ruthless tyrants, the conflicts, and so forth. And in your new world, you talk about a new world disorder that is still very much with us. And in your 2006 Alec Roche lecture, you sum it up as the madness of the international world.
Yes, I've always used the word madness to describe it because, and I don't think that's a peculiar or provocative word to use, because then people say, what do you mean by madness? And it is living within a reality which is unreal, dangerous, undesirable in the long term. And I think the human race, particularly in the 20th century, did sort of go mad. The human race became a danger to itself because it was living in a reality which could only lead to self-harming and self-destruction, which is, using the crude word mad, what madness seems to be. I mean, madness, as Foucault and others have said, is a thing you define conventionally. It's not an absolute state. But if you define it conventionally, it must involve that it is going into a reality which, in the end, is self-harming and self-destructive. And who was I reading recently? Oh, I think it was one of the pre-Socratic philosophers, Democritus, saying a thing that a million people have said, namely that if all the world except half a dozen people were mad or ill, they would say those half a dozen people were mad or ill. They would regard themselves as sane, all these mad people. And that's the feeling I've always had. And sometimes one used to look round, say at the Security Council or the General Assembly, and think this is sort of a madhouse. It's mad. Because this can only lead to terrible results. But it seems rational. They're all dressed in beautiful suits and speaking very well. But it leads to 100 million dead. And most of the world suffering. It seems obvious that it must be mad. And people sort of think, I shouldn't use such a strong word, but I think it's almost literally true on any conventional definition of madness. But it does put one in a difficult position. And for example, on a thing like human rights, well, a thing like war, for example, I remember saying to Christopher Greenwood, who was the great man on the law of war and who's now on the International Court, when he was a student here, that there should be no such thing as the law of war. Don't you realize that to put law and war together is terrible? You can't have a law of war. That's ridiculous. War is mass murder and indiscriminate destruction of property. You can't have a law of that. So I've never had anything to do with the law of war. And of course it's now a huge, huge subject, and it's got a much classier name, humanitarian law or something, which I still can't apply my mind to at all. And I've always taken the view that in a war you should win it as quickly as possible and do anything necessary to win it. The job should be that it should stop in 3 weeks, but by any means it should be stopped. And of course one's not the first person to say that. People have been saying it since the dawn of time, that war is a disgrace to the human race. But then it was, of course, bureaucratized in the League of Nations and the United Nations. Governments got together and said, I tell you what, let's have a bit of a system for war. And we'll only go to war and murder our ordinary people by the million if we can't talk ourselves out of it for a bit. Oh, unbelievably terrible. So I made a huge study of the origins of the First World War, and it is infinitely sad. These were highly intelligent people on both sides. But somehow they got themselves into this position. And it's incredible. On that day in 1914, they sort of got tired and said, oh dear, well, that's right, somebody better invade somebody tomorrow. And then it was 4 years of unspeakable horror. So that, as an academic, you're not supposed to be emotional about these things. But I don't see how for half a second you can be unemotional about war. And so I formed very strong views on human rights as well. When I was in the Foreign Office, I refused to have anything to do with them. Human rights, the law of human rights. Because I think that, and other people have now taken up saying this much more, that they were a very unfortunate development after the Second World War, international human rights, because they reduced to a series of texts, formulas, the most ultimate human values. They devalued the highest human values. They made them stuff that lawyers work on and make money out of. That's terrible. And so governments liked them because they were, and then they could argue, no, my lord, look at the comma in Article 42. It's after the word if, and that means that we haven't breached human rights. Incredible. But other people are now saying this. David Kennedy has written about it. That these can be dangerous figments of the imagination, really. And governments, as I've always written, should be terrified of human rights. They shouldn't have well-paid lawyers dealing with them. They should be frightened. Because that's how the rights approach began, essentially in this country, from medieval period. They're just things we shouted at the king. I'm terribly sorry, you cannot do that. And that eventually became vaguely codified in the Bill of Rights, and then in the American Bill of Rights, and then in the French Declaration of Rights. So it's sort of gone downhill. But when we said it to medieval kings and Tudor kings, we meant that I'm terribly sorry, you're not respecting the fundamental values of our society. You may think you can do what you like, you can't. And now we can't use that argument. All we can say is that you shouldn't be in breach of Article 17, paragraph 2 or something. That's ridiculous. So I feel a bit strongly about that.
Do you think that after the false dawn of the Berlin Wall collapsing, that humans, with all their cultural and their political differences, can really bring about a new order?
No, well, I think the problem has changed because of globalization, namely that if you left it to governments and vast international corporations, obviously nothing would ever change. They would keep drafting things, like the things we discussed before, the friendly relations and the Declaration on Aggression and all that sort of ridiculous thing. But I think the whole situation is now changing so dramatically in that as more countries take off, to use a phrase that was popular a long time ago, and then it was Jean Rostow, I think, invented it, but then went out of fashion and now is in fashion again, that countries like China and India and Brazil and others have been sort of taking off to join the most advanced countries. So the world is changing in that sense, that the socialization at the lower level is now going so fast, and the recent obviously events in the Middle East are connected with it, that people's expectations are changing. And that was a very popular way of analysing social situations some years ago, and then again went out of favour. The people in a society essentially have expectations. And it's the question of what those expectations are and who creates them. And for the most part, obviously, tyrannies can absolutely switch off people's expectations, and indeed can lead to them not having any expectations at all. But as soon as they start having expectations, you're essentially in a revolutionary situation. And because of the internet and Twitter and all these things that I don't know about, it probably is the case that the expectations of ordinary people are changing. And even at the simplest level, they want cars and washing machines and all the rest of it. And then they suddenly turn around and say, why on earth haven't we got these things? We see them on television every day of the week. It happened in Eastern Europe. They just couldn't understand, why have we not got all these things? So I think something sort of revolutionary is happening in what used to be called revolution of rising expectations. You can stop them. And China at the moment, as you know, is desperately trying to stop this, stop people looking at foreign television and the internet and so on. Awful as television is, if they, on these ridiculous programs, see all these things, obviously they just sort of ask themselves, why on earth don't we have them? And the fact that in the Middle East they've sat there 30, 40, 50 years without any real progress is unbelievable. So I think there's a sense in which, although 1990 left the structure just as it was, international structure is just the same as it ever was, something underneath that structure is changing, and in the direction one would want, obviously, enormously. So I've been very keen on regime change. I was keen on the Iraq War, because I think they should be just got rid of all these people. It's unbelievable. These corrupt criminals have been sitting there for 30, 40, 50 years running these countries. Unbelievable.
Interesting. Do you envisage a new order as being some form of superstate with a universal law?
No, well, that's, again, what people have accused me of. They say, you want a superstate governing the world, don't you? Did I tell you that story about the demonstration against me?
No.
In Indiana?
No.
You sure?
No.
Because I went to give a talk at, I think, the University of Indiana. And outside the room, there were people distributing leaflets. And I didn't think much about it. And there were police. I didn't think much about it. And then somebody told me it is a group, because the title of my talk was something like Towards a New World Order or something, talk I've given 1,000,000 times. And apparently this is a group of extreme right-wing Americans for whom the phrase New World Order is dynamite, because they see that as being a conspiracy to destroy the United States. And so they go around demonstrating. And so this was the only demonstration I've ever had against me, I think. And so they came in and sat in the front row, these people. And then in the question time, they started asking questions. And one of them said, you're in favour of a world state and destroying the United States, aren't you? And I said, well, it's funny that the one thing I'm totally and absolutely against is a world state and world government. We are unhappy enough about our own governments and states. The last thing we want to do, it's an utter nightmare, is to create a world state. So that rather silenced them. And then one of them said, all this stuff about human rights, that's trying to impose foreign values on America, isn't it? And I said, I'm terribly sorry to disappoint you, but I've spent my life saying that human rights are a very bad thing. And that sort of silenced them. It was very funny. And afterwards I was told that this group had murdered a judge in Chicago who had decided to put one of their lot in prison or something. So I felt, and I hadn't known before I went out exactly who these people were, but thank goodness I'd given the right answer to these questions. Otherwise they might have shot me, I suppose. But that's my answer to what people always say, that, oh, you want vast institutions. The last thing, I've been writing against governments forever.
That is one of your preoccupations, that you place much that is wrong with the world at the door of the nation state, which is a very bad vehicle for human harmony. Right. To quote from Eunomia, page 24, corrupt, arrogant, incompetent governments.
Well, I think that's putting it mildly, to be quite honest. You have to remember, I don't know what the number would be, but the number of what I call criminal conspiracies known as governments. That's all they are. And in this latest novel, one of the suggestions that they've got is to stop what I call red carpetism. It's ridiculous that these wicked criminals called presidents and so on, they roll out a red carpet. They should be shot. It's ridiculous. So they're going to advocate the abolition of red carpets at airports, I think. Because it's mad. These are criminals. They're like mafia people. They've stolen the resources of the people. They've put it in Zurich. And they and their family then live like medieval potentates. And we treat them as respectable people.
Nowhere has human moralizing been as relentlessly practiced as in the international realm inhabited by states. And that's from an article in the European Journal of International Law.
Yes, well, morality in the international system is a very great problem, because morality in national society is a problem, huge problem. It used to be a problem when there was a lot of religion around, because one of the main functions of religion is to explain morality and enforce morality. But when religion declined, or when you get into a completely cross-cultural situation where you can't rely on any particular religion, it becomes incredibly difficult to know what the basis of morality should be. So morality then remains as a rhetoric, and it's a rhetoric available to governments, because it's very upmarket rhetoric. But it may be based on nothing whatsoever. And I remember when I used to give lectures on law and philosophy, and we was doing the history of moral philosophy, I suddenly looked at the students and realized that perhaps they have no conception of morality if they're not religious. What on earth does it mean? Why should one do this or should one not do that? For what earth? Why? And that was discovered in the 19th century when religion declined. There were about 1,000 or 10,000 books on the basis of morality. How can you possibly find a basis other than religion for morality? Well, that, of course, is what Plato and Aristotle wrote about enormously. The good. And so internationally, morality obviously is not in any powerful sense available internationally. And I think I may have quoted before Cavour, the Italian statesman, who said we do things internationally we would not dream of doing nationally. In other words, they'd be just immoral. So that is a huge challenge, and my only answer to it is that morality obviously must depend on the cohesive values of a society. And until we get the self-consciousness international system as a society, there will not be high values shared. Human rights are not global high values, as the people keep calling them. High values are much higher than that. But as soon as you've got a society, you must, almost by definition, have a cohesion of high values. Society. They're unspoken, mostly. And then some of them are embodied in the law. Obviously, that's one of the functions of the law, to embody society's highest values. And so internationally, too, when we have a self-consciousness, human self-consciousness, global self-consciousness of us all belonging to a society, then it will sort of become more obvious that there must be high values even for the whole of humanity. What they'll be, I don't decree. And people keep telling me that you should draw up. But not at all. Societies develop in the deepest evolutionary way a sense of their own high values. And then morality becomes a deduction from these more or less unspoken high values. And I think they will emerge. And again, a million classical philosophers have written about this problem of humanity's intrinsic, Stoicism, that's what Stoicism is about, humanity's intrinsic high values. And that's why I have these things in the novels to remind people that, one or two people have thought about these problems. Quite intelligent, serious people have thought about them. And all this stuff is available. When now we're faced with the ultimate problem, which is the high values of the whole of humanity. And you can't think of a more interesting subject for a philosopher than that, can you? How should humanity see itself as a self-perfecting species? How should it imagine itself? Perhaps we should stop there, because my voice seems to be going.
And there's quite a few more concerns which would be interesting to hear of, Professor. So if we stopped at this point, all that remains is for me to thank you so much for yet another outstanding interview, and I look forward very much to continuing this hopefully next week.
Well, I thank you for having kindness to listen.
It's been my pleasure, my privilege.
But
thank you.
Yes, and another thing in writing the third novel is I have to decide eventually who marries whom. Which is a lovely feeling of power. I think I know who's going to marry whom.
Oh, wow. Such lovely characters, some of the characters.
Yes, I'm afraid one of them has to die of old age, but...
The cardinal, perhaps?
No, I'm afraid the countess is going to die eventually.
Oh.
And her husband has... no, he's not her husband, my goodness me. Mr. Gray has bought an island in the British Virgin Islands, and I can't decide whether he's going to go mad there. Like Marlon Brando in that film.
That's right. Apocalypse, I think it was called.
Apocalypse Now.
Yes.
That's right. Yes.
That's right. Well,
I can't quite decide. 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 Can't quite